Well, hello out there, Internet, and welcome to another episode of Sandboxx News. My name is Alex Hollings. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, a journalist, and the editor around these parts, and today I'm going to take you through 5 of the biggest stories that we've covered over the past week, starting with a question we've been getting a lot lately, which is why is the Space Force's uniform camouflage? It's not like you need that in orbit. Then we're going to move on to an elite special operations unit that you've certainly heard of, but may not know much about, and a piece written by legendary Delta Force operator George E. Hand IV called, Why Does America Need a Delta Force? Then, we're going to move on to 3 reasons I think it's high time for us to change the Washington Redskins name to the Washington REDTAILS, and I even got some input from the grandson of one of the first 5 Tuskegee Airmen. Then we're going to move on to China's newest stealth fighter, the J-20B, and how it's actually a pretty good match for some of America's top-tier jets. And then finally, before we go, we're going to close with Jack Murphy's new streaming show, The Team House, and how it's shining a light on the real people behind some of America's most elaborate and intense covert operations. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Our first story today is all about the Space Force, because what could be more interesting than a brand new military branch dedicated to fighting wars in outer space? Of course, that's not really what they do. The real primary role of the Space Force is actually to track orbital bodies and mitigate any threat they may pose to our satellite infrastructure. More often than not, that means keeping tabs on space junk, but it also means finding ways to launch replacement satellites quickly, finding ways to harden our existing systems, and also tracking some orbital bodies that we believe are actually weapons China and Russia have already put into orbit. Now, none of that really explains why their uniforms are camouflage, but the answer there is actually pretty simple too. You see, the majority of the Space Force personnel right now are actually made up of the former U.S. Air Force Space Command. What that means is that they're just still wearing the same uniforms they always have. Now, it seems likely that down the road, the Space Force will establish its own uniform system. But to be honest, that's pretty expensive, and it takes a long time. So it's likely that we're going to see the Space Force wearing those same old Army and Air Force BDUs that we always have for some time to come. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the Space Force, you want to know how airmen can transfer over to the Space Force, or maybe you want to find out why their logo looks so much like the logo for Star Trek's Federation of Planets. We've got stories about all this on Sandboxx News, and I recommend you give them a look. Our next story is all about why America needs the Delta Force, as penned by legendary Delta Force operator George E. Hand IV, who also so happens to be a personal hero of mine. So I loved reading this piece where he explains why Delta was founded, which was ultimately to solve a problem that no other unit could. And today's Delta Force continues to operate in that exact same capacity. In the article, George talks about what Delta specializes in, like CQB, which is close quarters battle, as well as what it takes to make it in this elite special operations unit. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the Delta Force, or maybe you want to fight your way into becoming a Green Beret yourself, I highly recommend you read George's articles, Why America Needs the Delta Force, and Cutting the Mustard in Green Beret Selection. They're really worth your time. Our next story is all about the former Washington Redskins' search for a new name, and why I think the REDTAILS is the best possible option. Now, if you're not familiar with the name REDTAILS, it was a nickname given to the famed Tuskegee Airmen, who were a group of black aviators who flew over 15,000 combat sorties over Europe and Northern Africa in World War II. Now, in a time when America's military was still segregated, the REDTAILS would be requested by name for particularly dangerous or difficult missions because of their bravery and technical prowess. In fact, over 150 Flying Crosses were awarded to Tuskegee Airmen throughout the war. Now, in this piece, I also spoke to Harry Alford, who's a Sandboxx News contributor and the grandson of one of the first 5 Tuskegee Airmen, Charles DeBow, to see what he thinks about the possibility of naming a football team that plays in America's capital after this famed group of black military aviators. Now, this piece is just my opinion, so I recommend you read it, and I'd be interested to hear yours. Let me know what you think. Now, if you know me, you know I can't avoid a good fighter jet story, and that's why this week we're talking about China's recent announcement that the J-20B is moving into mass production. Now, the J-20B is the second iteration of China's J-20, which is a plane based on stolen plans for America's own F-22 Raptor. The J-20B differentiates itself from the J-20 through thrust vector control, which is a way to actually change the direction of the exhaust moving out of a jet engine. Now, having this allows the J-20B to perform some incredibly acrobatic stunts that can be a real advantage in a dogfight. Now, in a deep dive analysis I wrote this week, I explain what this means for America's defensive role in the Pacific, how American and Chinese fighters stack up, and who we can still expect to win if an air war were ever to break out between these two powers. I highly recommend you give this one a read, especially if you, like me, watch Top Gun every 6 months. And finally, the last story I've got for you this week is my interview with former Green Beret and Army Ranger Jack Murphy, who hosts the streaming show The Team House. Now, each week on The Team House, Murphy and fellow vet David Park bring on legends from the special operations and intelligence communities to tell the real stories of America's covert operations. After just a few episodes of this show, you'll realize quickly that America's real covert operations are a lot crazier than you've seen on TV. And in this interview, Jack explains why it's so important that we get these stories from the people that lived them. He also gives us some highlights from the past 50 episodes. I highly recommend you give this interview a read, and I highly recommend you give The Team House a watch. And that's it for this week's episode of Sandboxx News. I want to thank you for tuning in and remind you to click like and subscribe down below. Maybe hit that little bell icon so that you'll know every time a new episode comes up. And make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com every day for the latest and greatest news from all around the force. Until next week, I'm Alex Hollings. Thanks for stopping by.